Hey everyone, welcome to 21st Century HR Live. I'm your host, Lars Schmidt. It's Monday. It's an official day. We're still using calendars, so I hope all of you had good weekends and your weeks are off to a good start and you're having a great May the 4th. I'm enjoying all the Star Wars memes out there as well, so keep those going. Today's episode, I'm really excited. I'm going to be able to talk to a good friend of mine, Gerry Crispin. Gerry is the founder and co-principal of Career Crossroads, or CXR, an organization that he's been building for over a decade and now runs with our mutual good friend, Chris Hoyt. So Gerry and I are going to cover a range of topics, and I'm excited to bring him on. He's actually doing this recording live from his Airstream, so we're also going to get to check that out. I also want to remind all the viewers, for those of you that are new to the show, this is an interactive show. So if you have questions for Gerry, wherever you're streaming this, go ahead and ask those in the comment section, and I'll do my best to get those covered with Gerry on air. So with that, let me bring Gerry into the conversation, and we'll get things kicked off. Gerry, how are you?
I'm wonderful. Life is good. Good to be here, Lars.
Good to have you here. So, you are, especially for any recruiters watching this, you're a man that needs no introduction, but it would be a weird show to have a guest not give any introduction. So let's start there. Why don't you give the viewers just a quick introduction and background on you?
Well, I've been around a long time, for sure, as some folks might be able to figure that out. And actually, I would have to say almost 50 years in recruiting, one way or the other. The last 20 years with Career Crossroads, or 25 years actually with Career Crossroads, and 20 years with a community of TA leaders that really are committed to helping one another. And so it's typically large companies, about 100 of them are fully engaged with each other in trying to help each other out as it relates to best practices.
Yeah, and so Gerry, you have a really unique lens to the current climate that we're in right now. Obviously, you've been in this space for quite some time. You've seen a lot. You've seen as much as any of us in terms of different economic downturns, global events, etc. Obviously, this is something quite unique that we really haven't experienced. And I think you have a really interesting vantage point through your CXR community. You are working with the global heads of recruiting and talent for some of the biggest companies in the world. And so you're a part of those conversations as they're talking about how COVID is impacting their business, their operations, their plans. Give us a window into that. Like, when you're kind of joining those conversations, what are people talking about? What's on talent leaders' minds the most right now as it relates to COVID?
Yeah, as you were saying that, I'm thinking to myself, it's changing almost daily. So it's almost, what day are we talking about in terms of that? Certainly, when this all started, really 2 months, for the most part, 2 months ago, I was in a conference in Toronto, the last conference I was in. And suddenly there were phone calls made to the heads of talent acquisition who were also in that conference. And the phone calls were short. They were typically a CHRO calling the head of TA saying, "Come home, like right now. Don't even stop. Just go to the airport and come back. We don't know at this moment whether or not I can get you out of Canada if you don't come home right now." And it was that kind of thing that suddenly started red flags everywhere. And the next thing was getting a note from a talent acquisition leader saying, "I can't go public today, but within the next week, we may lay off 20,000 people or 50,000 people." And I started getting a bunch of those. And basically what they wanted to do was to talk to each other and talk about, is this happening to you too? And how are you thinking about this? And at the other side of this, there were a few folks who were suddenly being tasked by, again, their C-level leaders that we may have to hire large numbers of people in addition to what we've been hiring, literally almost immediately. And so that was kind of the beginning of those kinds of issues. And where we are today, 2 months later, the evolution is such that I have no doubt that this will change work for generations of professionals coming into it, probably for the next decade, 2 decades. I don't think we're going to go back to normal, whatever normal was before. And I know a lot of people are predicting that. It's very easy to predict at this point, because who knows? But I have to tell you, Lars, I'm seeing behaviors that are very, very different than ever before. So, one obvious example is the video. People constantly talk about that we're going to be doing work from home, video meetings, etc. It's just going to become part and parcel of what we do. But there's one observation that I've noted, and that is that when you have a Zoom meeting in the old days, about half of the people would never show their face. Today, when we have a Zoom meeting with 20, 30, 40 people in the room, almost everyone shows their face and is fully engaged in having a conversation with one another. It's almost a hunger to kind of have something that represents face to face. So the shift, I think, has taken an interesting turn from that point of view. Another example that I give you is that we had a conversation with a bunch of team leaders in Europe just 2 weeks ago, and it turns out that without having the conversation to begin with, every single one of those team leaders was having a morning call on Zoom with their entire team, and the team might have been 5 people, or it might have been 20, and all of them did not talk about work for at least a half an hour at the beginning of each meeting. People basically talked about, how are you?
Yeah.
How's your family? Now, that might be obvious, but what it stimulates in my thinking is all of the cultures around the world, like Brazil and Argentina and some places in Asia, where the conversation at the start of a meeting is always about personal items. In the United States, if somebody were to call someone in New York, for example, for a meeting, you would not be talking for very long about family, etc. People want you to get to the point. Let's get business done, and then let's get off. And that's pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
But with where we are now, I think there's a pivot between the importance of a network shifting to the importance of community, which involves a value for the relationship, not the quantity of the people that you know.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it's interesting too. I think you and I are both big community builders, community believers. We both champion the ideas around open source and working out loud and collaboration. I think to your point around Zoom, people are craving that connection. Obviously, many people are sheltering in place. Many people are rarely leaving the home. They're certainly not going into an office and interacting with coworkers like they used to, and they likely won't be doing that anytime soon. Like, I think it's really interesting to think about how the world of work is changing. The only thing we know for sure is that we're not going back to how things were, right? That's just not going to be a possibility. And so what that looks like, I think, is clearly unknown, and in large part is up to us to define in many ways. And so I think that there's I'm really intrigued, and I'm just starting to work now on a Fast Company story around this, around like if we're rebuilding what it means to work, right? Like what the construct of work is now and going forward, kind of based on these new realities. what does that look like? And, it's interesting. Like you see a lot of CEOs talking about from an IT perspective, the acceleration over the last, 2 months compared to, is usually like 2 years worth of innovation that's been condensed down. I think that as we start to, really calibrate how we're going to be adapting our businesses and our work, right, the constructs of work for our employees after this, it's going to require something similar. And so I'm really intrigued. Before we wrap up, I want to get into kind of predictions with you, because I'm curious to get your take on where things are heading. But I want to come back to something you said earlier, which is in the early stages of this, as you were talking with leaders from the CXR community, and they were kind of looking to each other to say, like, are you seeing this? Are you adjusting that? And to me, that was something that I certainly saw as well at scale, where like this was an unprecedented scenario. And there was no playbook, there was no script. So peers were looking to each other around like, what are you doing around this thing? What are you doing? And we're seeing it now around return to work plans, right? As people leaders are trying to create something that's never been done before. And so when you see that collaboration, that openness, I know you've always seen it because it's instilled and ingrained in the communities that you build. But you're probably now starting to see it in areas outside of those, communities that you nurture, where maybe historically they've been more siloed. Now they're embracing being more open. I'm curious to get your thoughts on that shift, because in my view, I think we can't go back to that siloed piece, and I think we won't. And I think that mindset is going to be the minority. But I'm curious to get your take. How do you see this impacting, longer term views around, working out loud, open source, collaboration, all the things that I know are important to you?
So I think first and foremost, people are beginning to recognize that there is no such thing as an expert. There never really was. An expert, almost by definition, is somebody who paid attention to the people who are actually doing things, put that into some kind of box, and then sold the box to a lot of other people. But because nobody can figure out what next is, the best that you can do is talk to people who are doing what you have to do. So peers and colleagues now are talking to each other in greater frequency than ever before. And so, and respecting the point of view of people who have to do the work, and trying to figure out where the common elements are, not necessarily benchmarking from a copying point of view, but benchmarking in terms of really trying to understand the range of different possibilities for the practices, the systems, and other kinds of things. And so, I think what you're going to see is a shift in organizational style that will better enhance what people have been talking about for a couple of years now, agility. We're going to see more power in the groups that have to do the work and their ability to engage each other. So peers being able to collaborate, not just to talk to one another, but to make decisions, to invest part of the company's money, to experiment and do much more piloting, to find the kinds of practices that will forward the performance of the organization. And that's always been conceptually what people wanted to do, is to push down decision making. But I think you're going to see that taking root really in many, many more corporations. And what that means is that the style of leadership of those teams has to change from a top-down, more authoritarian control and command kind of approach to much more servant leadership, where communicating and inspiring the vision of the organization becomes critical, and the interest in caring for those people who make up the band, if you will, that works and professionally makes the company work, is going to be a critical issue. And I think there's a lot of companies that will not be able to make that shift. And certainly there's an awful lot of companies that are, that we know of and often talk about, that not only have made the shift, but probably have pioneered it over the last 5 to 10 years. And I think they will be the kind of companies that employees will want to work for and actually put energy and effort into trying to compete for the kinds of openings in those kinds of companies. So, yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of change.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. I would even add, like from a remote standpoint, right? As more companies, obviously, this was a massive accelerant for a lot of companies that maybe had pockets of remote to be entirely distributed. And now they're developing return to work plans. Some employees will be in some offices in some companies, but I think most companies that have the capabilities of having remote employees will have a subset of their population from here on out that will be remote. And from a talent perspective, now you're able to recruit in broader geos than you had before, and even globally in some cases. And so the access to talent in different markets, the ability to compete for talent in markets that in January you didn't have that option, now you do. I think that's going to be seismic in terms of really kind of shifting the playing field of talent density models in different cities. Right, you don't have to go to San Francisco. You don't have to go to New York. You don't have to go to London. So,
Lars, it's not going to be the employer that makes those choices to act that way. I think the demand is going to come from the candidates whose decision making, right, is going to shift, and what they weight from a value point of view in a job in relation to the career and a career in relation to their life is going to change significantly. And so the employers are going to be driven, if they're smart, they'll embrace driving in that direction. So I think that talent acquisition has a role to play in kind of rethinking how the employer brand might in fact shift and weight different values that make up that brand differently to accommodate the kinds of work that people will want to be involved in.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. I mean, employer brand is certainly impacted by all this. And speaking of that, I actually had a conversation last week with our friend Susan Lamott, and she has a question for us from LinkedIn. She mentioned that as we kind of talked earlier in the conversation around some of the European talent acquisition teams starting their meetings with just talking about how people are doing and family. She mentioned that after 9/11, it was a similar kind of tone, particularly in the US, where those kind of conversations around, family and personal narratives were much more prevalent. And then that faded over time. And she's curious to get your take. Like, do you see that fading as well, or do you think that's here to stay?
Well, the world that I would want is one in which it's here to stay. The possibility that it fades, I think is certainly there. It depends really on I think the reason why it may be permanent is because of the length of time that this pandemic is impacting us. And for example, if someone like myself has to stay inside and I can no longer hug my relatives or my grandkids for a year or more, you can bet that that impacts me in a very personal way for a very extended point of view, and it affects how I see the world at that point. So if it's all better in the next week, then I think it's more likely going to fade away. But if it takes months more for things to come out to as near where we were before from an economic point of view, I think it will imprint itself on so many different parts of our workforce, from the kids who are starting to work, to those who are kind of in their last legs, to those who've had some serious economic downsides to all of this. So in my opinion, I think that it will be permanent. I think that there's going to be potentially a demand that folks who are moving from this network to this community approach, if you're in a community approach and I care about my fellow workers, you're starting to talk about the kind of thing that used to 100 years ago in the Depression was a union. And we know that the unions got corrupted in the long run. But the fact is, they started as a means for workers to have some influence on the on the environment that they work in, that ensures that it's safe, that ensures that their health is taken care of, that ensures that if they get sick, they're still, somebody's still out there for them. And I got to tell you, I think that you may see, they won't call it unions, but it may be a guild or something else. That's kind of what I've been saying. There's going to be a whole new structure, if you will, for how communities might exert their influence inside of corporations, however you call it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I can't recall where I was reading it. I think these days, probably like you're just reading so many articles that are coming up that are kind of predictions on the future. But one of the concepts was that basically, you would start to see groups of employees, groups of talent with different skill sets, but complementary skill sets, almost as like an agile free agent team that companies would engage to work with them on projects, and they would work together. They would bring in other assets in and out depending on the skill sets that exist in that group, but they would almost kind of, instead of all going to work for a company, they would loosely band together as a collective of talent to come into projects and help companies solve problems. And I think that is really intriguing. I think we're going to see a lot more agile approaches from companies that just aren't going to be in a position to, go out and hire all of the X staff they think might be necessary for a project, including some projects that might not be a priority for the business. It's like they're going to have to be really laser focused on the resources and the talent necessary to help them solve the challenges and build the products that they need today, as opposed to some longer term thinking. And I'm curious, as we talk about kind of collectives and people banding together, you announced last week that you joined forces with Smart Recruiters and a few other groups, Marin Hogan, Red Branch, and others, to develop recruiters.com. And so I'd love to just turn it over to you. I'd love to, help you, have you explain to viewers more about where that initiative came from, what it's about, how to get involved, and everything else.
Well, the backstory really is very simple. The employers were using this new term called furlough. And there is no standard definition for furlough. Some workers, some furloughed employees are getting paid. Some furloughed workers have their benefits. Some furloughed workers have nothing. But there is some common issue here. And that is that most of the large companies that have used that term sincerely believe that at the end of this pandemic, they want those workers back, that they actually care about the people that they're having to lay off. And they want to demonstrate that. And in many ways, they're attempting to do that. And so when we got a whole group of technology folks together and basically asked the large employers who are doing most of the furloughing, or some of those who are doing some of the surge hiring, to describe what good would look like if technology organizations in our space came together and collaborated on a kind of a single approach. And what the technology companies basically said is, and I'll paraphrase, is we can't quite do that because we're already individually teeing up something similar for our clients and perhaps beyond our clients. But we do want to try to pay it forward, to add value to the folks out there that are doing this. And so each one of them was doing something. There's at least 30 or 40 of those kinds of things out there. We did get a few of those technology groups and a few of the employers to say, yeah, let's collaborate on something a little bit narrower. And so let's talk about our own. And our own are our recruiters. And that's when someone said, recruiters recruiting recruiters. And I'm beginning to say that better when I say it fast. But in any case, we suddenly realized that we could do something there. But we wanted to, and the employers were the ones who were insistent on the fact that if we're letting our recruiters go, even temporarily, we want to make sure that we continue communicating with them. We want to make sure that they're treated fairly wherever we send them. Otherwise, we're going to have more trouble getting them back when we want them back. And so we want to be perceived as helping them, not just in terms of finding a job, but also in how they're treated when they look for a job and don't quite get it, for example. So that's why the code of conduct was raised as to how we could not only measure it, but what was it? And so we established a simple bar that basically said, if you're going to touch a recruiter in a recruiting manner, either because they applied for a job or you're calling them and contacting them directly, one, there's a need to establish expectations. Two, there's a need to deliver against those expectations. And three, no black hole. And if that isn't done, then you shouldn't be using this platform. And so we now have a mechanism to accomplish that. We pre-approved about 250 companies, scraped those companies, and filtered out the jobs that were for recruiters, and there were several hundreds. So we knew there were enough jobs out there that were still companies were still trying to fill. But certainly it's not, the intention is not that it's the largest database of jobs in the world. It never will be. But it does require every employer participating to agree to a code of conduct. And that will be audited and it will be enforced. And we want it to grow. So we added about 50, I think in the last 3 or 4 days, we added another 50 employers and approved them. I disapproved 20 because we are not in a position to really audit the behavior of recruiters who are recruiting recruiters for companies they don't represent. So staffing, temporary and permanent placement agencies are not approved, but if they can still support us, if they tell folks about us, they can still join the consortium. We want technology companies out there that are willing to share with their employer populations that recruiting recruiters recruiting recruiters is in fact real. And we want a directory of companies and organizations that have stood up similar kinds of platforms to help recruiters find jobs or recruiters find other folks that they want to recruit. So we've identified and written up and created links to about 30 other organizations, including the list of links that you have, Lars. And we'll continue to build on that so that we can offer recruiters a place where they can help one another and ideally crowdsource which tools are the best for them in finding a job.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. And I would be keen to, as this unfolds over the coming weeks and I'd imagine months, would love to hear more about the metrics and the connections that you're able to make through that and the auditing process, because I know that
I expect a number of people to be ticked off and call me, and I have my phone number and my email address out as well in relation to that.
Yeah.
But I, for the most part, the response has been extremely positive about a place that will not screw with the people who don't get hired, that they at least deserve to hear that we're not going forward with you. You think that would also be a standard for a standard recruiting practice for our profession, but it's not.
Yeah.
And this is one attempt to make it so.
Cool. Well, Gerry, I have one last question for you. We close every episode with a little bit called One Good Thing. And so I want to let you get the closing word and just share with the viewers, one good thing from your past week. And I will not define it in any way. So I will leave it to you.
One good thing. Well, obviously we launched recruiters recruiting recruiters last week. So that was, to me, an extraordinary opportunity to deliver against something that we thought about and had support for, and were able to collaborate on. The other thing that I think is every day is the number of people that I see paying it forward in one way or the other. It may be that they're involved in something in their community. It may be that they've just been inspired by other things that other people are doing. It may be that this has been going on always for lots of people, and it's just never been reported. But it just seems to me that more and more I'm hearing really good stories about the efforts that people are making to help one another, both in how they handle their work, to just how they handle their neighbors. And for me, that's not only exciting or interesting as one good thing, but it's inspiring, I think, for all of us to kind of embrace the positive side of any disaster, and that's happening now.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot to be celebrated when it comes to that, and I think that that's those are things that we have to look for actively in some cases. We're kind of in this weird state where bad news and hard news is what gets clicks, and that comes across our stream with no effort. Sometimes you have to make a little more effort to find the good news, but it's definitely out there. So Gerry, you're somebody who continually brings tremendous amounts of good news to the industry and everyone around you. So I want to thank you for that. And also thank you for making time to come on the show and share your journey.
Thank you, Lars. It's been a pleasure.
All right, everyone. So we're going to be back tomorrow, same time, noon Eastern, with Brian Adams and Charlotte Marshall to talk a little employer branding, their new book, and a lot more. So we'll see you then. In the meantime, stay safe and stay well.
Cool.